Chapter 1. The Trap. The wilderness had always been a place of contradiction to Lila. It was both a sanctuary and a labyrinth, a place where she could lose herself in the beauty of nature, but also where danger could lurk in the shadows, silent and waiting. Growing up in the city, she had always felt the pressure of the hustle and bustle, the noise of 1,000 voices, the endless stream of people, the technology that suffocated any chance of silence or peace. It was relentless, exhausting, and it wore her down to the very bone. She needed a break, an escape, a chance to reconnect with something real, something raw. So, with little more than a backpack filled with supplies, Lila set out on her solo trek into the wilderness. The northern forests, where the trees stood tall like ancient guardians of the earth, had always beckoned her. They had been her retreat when she needed solace, her sanctuary when the noise of life had become too overwhelming. They were vast, stretching for miles beyond the nearest town, an ancient expanse of trees and thick brush that seemed to stretch on forever. It was the kind of wilderness that drew people in with the promise of adventure and self-discovery, a place where the mind could wander as freely as the body. But on this particular day, something was different. Lila didn't pay much attention to the change in the weather at first. The clouds had gathered overhead, dark and threatening, but it wasn't unusual for the mountain weather to shift so quickly. The air had become cooler, the gentle breeze that had accompanied her along the trail, now carrying a chill that nipped at her exposed skin. Her jacket was packed away in her bag, but she had yet to take it out. The thought that the day would take such a turn never crossed her mind as she made her way deeper into the forest, the path now narrowing as the trees grew closer together, their branches forming a canopy above her, blocking out much of the light. She was lost in the tranquility of it all, lulled by the rhythm of her steps and the distant calls of birds in the trees. The trail that had started out as a well-worn path began to fade, the ground beneath her feet growing uneven and rocky. Her boots kicked up loose stones as she walked, each step sending a small echo through the forest, but the deeper she went, the less familiar the terrain seemed. The trees were no longer spaced evenly. Instead, they grew thick and tangled, their roots twisting above the surface, almost as though the forest itself were actively trying to swallow her up. Her sense of direction started to falter as the landscape seemed to shift in a way that felt unnatural. The shadows lengthened as the clouds gathered above, and she felt the first stirrings of unease creeping up her spine. But still, she pressed on. The forest around her grew darker as the sky grew darker. The sunlight had been obscured completely now, and the temperature had dropped several degrees. It was the kind of cold that made her feel exposed, even as the forest enveloped her in its canopy. She stopped for a moment, adjusting her backpack and reaching for the water bottle tucked into the side pouch, taking a long drink. Her breath misted in front of her, and the chill in the air seemed to cling to her skin like a second layer, seeping through her clothes. She glanced around, trying to spot any landmarks, but the trees were thick and unyielding, their trunks like massive walls, blocking her view. It was then that she heard it. The soft, almost imperceptible rustling of leaves, the faintest crack of a twig breaking. At first, she dismissed it as the wind or some small animal, perhaps a deer or a rabbit, but then it happened again. This time louder, closer, a noise, deliberate and purposeful, as if something or someone was moving through the underbrush. She froze, her breath caught in her throat, her senses sharpening. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, a primal instinct warning her that she was no longer alone. Her heart rate quickened, and she instinctively reached for the small knife she had tucked into her belt, her fingers brushing against the cold metal as she silently scolded herself for not being more prepared. She had wandered too far off the trail, had pushed too deep into the woods without thinking of the dangers lurking within. She wasn't just dealing with wildlife anymore. She was in the heart of the wilderness, untamed, unpredictable. Her instincts screamed at her to turn back, but her curiosity won out. What was out there? What could be making that noise? She had to know. She moved cautiously, her footsteps slow and deliberate, the air thick with the sound of her own heartbeat. She parted a cluster of branches, pushing through the undergrowth, her eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. The rustling sound came again, but this time, she saw something. Just a flicker of motion, something large, a shape darting between the trees. Before she could react, The ground beneath her feet gave way. A sudden, sharp tug, like an unseen force pulling at her leg, and she was falling. Her body jerked violently as if caught in the clutches of a powerful hand. She gasped, her arms flailing, trying to grasp anything to steady herself, but it was too late. Her leg was caught. Her body slammed to the ground, and she let out a sharp cry of pain as the world spun around her. She tried to move, but her leg was trapped, snared by something solid, something unyielding. Panic surged within her as she yanked and twisted, but the trap held her fast. She was caught, her body unable to escape the invisible force that had ensnared her. Her breath quickened, her chest rising and falling with the fear that now consumed her. She looked down in horror to see a thick metal loop wrapped around her ankle, a trap, an old, brutal thing, designed for larger game, meant to catch and hold. Her pulse raced as she tugged desperately against the trap, but it wouldn't give. The pain was sharp, searing, and her ankle throbbed with each movement. She screamed, her voice breaking the silence of the forest, a raw cry of desperation. She shouted for help, but she knew no one could hear her. The forest was vast and empty. No one was nearby. No one would come. Her panic grew as the light began to fade, the forest growing darker with each passing moment. The storm was coming, and she was stranded, trapped, alone. She screamed again, her voice raw, pleading for someone, anyone, to hear her. But all she could hear was the wind whipping through the trees and the pounding of her own heart. And then, just as she was about to give in to the darkness, she heard something a rustle in the underbrush, a footstep crunching on dry leaves. She stilled, her breath catching in her throat. Someone was coming. Her breath came in quick, panicked bursts as the metal trap around her ankle tightened with every attempt to free herself. Lila was no stranger to the wilderness, but this was different. This wasn't some lost trail or a harmless misstep. This was a trap, a vicious contraption meant to catch and hold something far stronger than her. She pulled again, her muscles screaming with exertion, but it was useless. The metal teeth of the trap bit deeper, and her leg felt as if it were on fire, the pain shooting up her calf. Desperation settled in, and her throat felt raw from the screams she had already released. The wind whistled through the trees, but there was nothing else, no sound of animals, no distant calls of birds, just her ragged breathing and the aching pull of the trap. The sky had darkened further, the storm she had ignored earlier now unmistakable as thunder rumbled overhead. The air grew thick with the smell of rain, and soon, fat droplets began to fall, splattering against the forest floor. She would be soaked through, the night growing colder by the second. But worse still, the trap kept her bound, her movements restricted, as helpless as a wounded animal. She stared down at her leg, trapped in the metal jaws of the contraption, a growing sense of dread creeping up her spine. How long would it be before the storm worsened? How long before the darkness swallowed her up completely? There was no telling if anyone would even find her. She had left the trail so long ago, and even if someone did pass by, the trap was in a thick patch of underbrush, difficult to spot. Her only hope was that someone, anyone, would hear her, but the more she screamed, the more she realized how futile it all seemed. Her hands trembled as she gripped the bars of the trap, trying to pry them apart in a panic-fueled fit. But there was no give, no movement. She could feel the pain in her ankle flare with every unsuccessful attempt, and the realization that she was completely alone, unable to move, started to sink in. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw something. At first, it was just a flicker, a shadow darting between the trees, too fast for her to make sense of it. She froze, eyes wide, waiting for something to happen. The flicker turned into a more definite shape. It was a figure, a man, walking cautiously toward her, his silhouette stark against the dimming light of the forest. "Hello," Lila called out, her voice a hoarse whisper. "Help, please." The figure didn't hesitate, nor did he seem surprised to find her in such a predicament. His eyes were focused, his steps sure as he approached, cutting through the dense underbrush like a man who had walked these woods many times before. He was tall, wearing rugged, practical clothing suited for the harsh conditions of the forest, and there was something about him, something steady, confident, that struck her in contrast to her own panic. "You're hurt," he said when he reached her, kneeling down next to her with the calmness of someone who had seen such things before. "I'm trapped," Lila gasped, her voice shaking from the effort to speak. "Please, I can't get out of this. I don't know what happened. I was walking and then dash." "I know," he interrupted, his tone gentle but authoritative. He didn't ask questions, didn't seem to care about the whys or hows, as though he had already assessed the situation and knew what to do. "This is a wild animal trap. They're made for big game." Lila's heart sank. "But how did I end up here?" "Sometimes the forest surprises us," he said cryptically, though there was no malice in his voice. "But don't worry. I'll get you out of it." His hands moved deftly, pulling out tools from his belt, tools that, to her surprise, didn't look like they were meant for animal traps at all. They were specialized, professional, almost surgical in nature. It was the kind of kit that someone who was accustomed to rough conditions, perhaps even someone who made a living off the land, would carry. His hands worked quickly, unhurried but precise, assessing the trap with expertise that left Lila astonished. "You're not from around here, are you?" she asked, her voice quieter now, trying to gauge him, to understand who he was. The forest was a place where people didn't just wander in uninvited. There were risks, even in the most beautiful parts of it. "No," he replied, giving her a small, knowing smile as his hands continued their work. "I'm not. But I've been here long enough." "Long enough for what?" Lila pressed, her curiosity rising despite the situation. She had no idea how he'd ended up here or how he had found her, but she was growing increasingly aware that this man was no ordinary traveler. There was a calmness to him that felt different from anyone she had met before. "Long enough to know the ways of the wilderness," he said, "and long enough to know when someone's been caught in a trap." There was something almost haunting in his eyes, a quiet intensity that made Lila feel both safe and unsettled at the same time. It was as though this man knew more than he was letting on. With a final click, the trap released with a heavy, mechanical sound, and Lila's leg was freed. She gasped in relief, but the pain in her ankle was sharp, and she winced as she tried to move. The stranger immediately caught her, his arms steadying her, guiding her gently but firmly to sit up. "You're lucky," he said, his voice still calm, though there was an undercurrent of something more serious now. "This could have been worse. You were in the middle of a hunter's trap. Those things are meant to hold something for hours. You've got cuts and bruises, but nothing too serious." Lila let out a shaky breath, too relieved to respond at first. Her ankle throbbed, but it wasn't broken. The pain would fade. What mattered was that she was alive, that she wasn't left to the whims of the forest. But there was something else that gnawed at her, the man before her. Who was he? How had he known to find her? And what was he doing so far out in the wilderness on his own? "Who are you?" she finally asked, her voice soft. The question had been lingering ever since he appeared out of nowhere, almost as if he had been waiting for her to fall into this trap. His eyes shifted slightly, an unreadable expression crossing his face for just a moment, before he offered a simple answer. "My name's Cade," he said. "I'm a tracker, and I guess I was just in the right place at the right time." He didn't seem to want to explain further, but Lila could sense there was more to his words than he was letting on. Something about this man seemed off, like there was a story he wasn't sharing, and she knew she'd never get to the bottom of it by asking. For now, she was just thankful he had come. The sound of the storm picking up in the distance reminded her that she wasn't out of danger yet. The rain was beginning to pour down heavily, and her soaked clothes clung to her skin. Cade's sharp eyes caught the shift in her expression, and without another word, he moved to help her to her feet, his hands gentle yet firm, the weight of the situation not lost on him. "We should find shelter," he said, leading her toward a small outcropping in the distance that seemed to offer some cover. The storm was intensifying, and Lila knew they had to move quickly if they were to avoid being trapped in the wilds overnight. The storm could be deadly here. As Cade helped her limp toward the shelter, the weight of the forest pressed in around her, the shadows deepening as the night took hold. Something had shifted in the air, something she couldn't place, but she knew this encounter would change everything. Cade was no ordinary man, and her life had just been irrevocably altered. Chapter 2: The Truth Behind the Silence. The storm gathered strength as the wind howled through the trees, the rain now coming down in sheets. It wasn't just a summer shower, it was a downpour, the kind of rain that could turn the earth into a slick, treacherous mess. Lila winced with each step, her ankle sore from the trap, but Cade's grip on her arm remained steady, and she didn't protest. There was something in the way he moved, so sure, so composed, as though the storm and the wildness of the forest were nothing more than background noise to him. They made their way through the thick underbrush, with Cade effortlessly cutting a path forward, his body agile and swift, like someone who knew the land intimately. Lila, in contrast, struggled to keep up, each step a reminder of the pain shooting up her leg. Yet, there was something oddly comforting about his presence, something about the way he moved through the storm as if it didn't faze him, as if he had walked these paths countless times before. The small shelter he led her to was little more than a natural overhang, tucked into the side of a cliff, with large rocks and dense trees providing some protection from the rain. Cade helped her sit down carefully beneath the overhang, and she gratefully leaned back against the rock. She shivered from the cold, her clothes soaked through, but the small fire Cade quickly started in the center of the shelter brought some warmth, and she couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. At least for now, she was safe if only temporarily. Cade knelt down beside the fire, his hands working quickly as he set up the small cooking pot he'd retrieved from his pack. The fire crackled, the only sound in the shelter, aside from the storm outside. Lila's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, and her body still trembled slightly from the shock of everything that had happened. She had been trapped, alone, with no one to help, and now, by some twist of fate, this man Cade had found her. She watched him as he moved, his quiet confidence both reassuring and mysterious. There was a heaviness to him, an unspoken burden that seemed to cling to his every movement, though he said little. The air between them was thick with the unasked questions, and Lila could feel the weight of them. When Cade finished setting up the fire and ensuring everything was secure, he sat down across from her, his eyes meeting hers. He didn't say anything at first, just watched her closely as if gauging her thoughts. Lila hesitated, unsure whether to break the silence. There was so much she wanted to ask him, so much she needed to know. Why had he been in the forest? Why had he been so far out? Why did you help me? She finally asked, the words spilling out before she could stop them. You didn't know me. You didn't have to come. Cade's gaze softened slightly, though there was still a guardedness to him. He sat back against the rock, his shoulders relaxed as he crossed his arms. The firelight flickered on his face, casting shadows that made him appear both older and younger at once, a man of many layers that Lila hadn't yet begun to peel back. I didn't have a choice, he said quietly, his voice steady and serious. The forest is full of dangers. More than just wild animals or traps. People get lost out here, especially in storms like this. And sometimes, it's not just the forest that's dangerous. Lila furrowed her brow, trying to make sense of his words. She had no reason to doubt him, but there was something about the way he spoke, the calmness with which he said it, that made her wonder. What do you mean? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Cade seemed to consider his answer, his gaze dropping to the fire for a moment. When he spoke again, his words were slower, heavier. There's more to these woods than anyone realizes. The people who live here, they're not just hunters or travelers. There's something else. And if you get too close to their territory, if you see too much of what they're doing, they won't let you leave. Lila felt a chill run through her despite the fire. What are you talking about? Cade leaned forward slightly, his voice quieter now. They're called the Ashborne, a tribe hidden deep within the forest, and they don't take kindly to outsiders. They've been here for generations, and no one knows where they came from or what they want. But they're dangerous, and when they find someone like you, someone who stumbles into their domain, they don't let you go. Not unless they've decided you're of use to them. Lila felt her breath catch in her throat. The forest, as beautiful and serene as it had seemed at first, now felt like a dangerous place, a place where shadows lurked in the dark, waiting to pounce. And you dash, she started, but Cade interrupted her. I'm not one of them, he said firmly. I'm a tracker. I've been out here for years. I've learned their ways, but I'm not part of them. I help those who get lost, those who don't belong out here. Like you. Lila's mind was reeling. She had gone into the forest for some peace, some time away from everything, but she had never imagined that it would lead her to a place like this, a place where danger was hidden in plain sight, where something dark and unknown moved among the trees. She glanced at Cade, studying him as though trying to discern whether or not she could trust him. But the look in his eyes told her he wasn't lying. And the trap? Was that them? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Cade nodded, his expression darkening. Yes, the Ashborne use traps like that, among other things. They catch anything that doesn't belong. And they have ways of making sure their secrets stay hidden. If they found you, you wouldn't have made it out. But now you're safe. Lila exhaled slowly, her heart still racing, but her mind beginning to piece things together. There was a strange comfort in Cade's presence, a feeling that, despite the dangers of the forest, she wasn't alone. But what happens now? She asked, her eyes meeting his. Cade stood, moving toward his pack and pulling out a small, weathered map. He unfolded it, laying it on the ground between them. We'll head out at first light. The storm will pass by then, and we'll have a better chance of making it out safely. I'll take you to the nearest town. From there, you can decide if you want to go back home or if you want to learn more about these woods. It's up to you. Lila looked down at the map, tracing the lines of the routes marked on it. There was a sense of finality in Cade's words, a conclusion that hadn't yet settled in her mind. But one thing was clear, her life was no longer just her own. The forest had changed her in ways she wasn't ready to understand, and Cade seemed to be the only person who could help her make sense of it. She nodded slowly. All right, I'll trust you. Cade gave her a brief, encouraging smile. Good. It's the only way out of here. Chapter 3, The Shadows of the Ashborne. The storm raged outside their small shelter, the rain falling in sheets, thundering against the forest canopy above them. Lila lay awake, her eyes tracing the shadows cast by the firelight, flickering across the rock walls of their makeshift refuge. The crackle of the fire, coupled with the howling winds outside, filled the air with a strange tension. But it wasn't the storm that kept her awake. It was the chilling knowledge that the forest around her was not just wild, it was dangerous. The Ashborne, this tribe Cade had mentioned, were not a myth. They were real, and she had wandered right into their territory. Her ankle still throbbed, but the pain was manageable now, the swelling having gone down thanks to the quick bandaging Cade had applied earlier. Despite the discomfort, the more pressing concern was the uncertainty that clung to every movement in the darkness, every shift in the wind, every crack of the branches swaying outside. She couldn't stop thinking about Cade's warning that the Ashborne would never let her go if they found her, that they didn't take kindly to outsiders. What did that mean for her future in this forest? What kind of danger had she truly stumbled into? Cade sat across from her, the firelight dancing in his sharp features, casting his face in shadows that only seemed to make him more enigmatic. His eyes never left the fire, but she could sense he was deep in thought. Perhaps he was considering how best to navigate the dangerous forest around them. Or maybe he was contemplating the Ashborne, who were always watching, always waiting. You don't look like you're from here, Lila said quietly, her voice barely rising above the wind. She had been meaning to ask him more about himself, but now the words spilled out before she could stop them. You seem to know this forest better than anyone I've ever met. But I don't understand. How did you become this? A tracker? What's your real story? Cade's expression softened, but he didn't immediately respond. He seemed to consider her question for a long moment before finally speaking. His voice was steady, though there was a faint edge to it, as if he were carefully choosing his words. It's a long story, he began, his eyes meeting hers for the first time since she'd asked the question. I wasn't always a tracker. I wasn't even from this part of the world. I grew up in a city, just like you. But I left when I was younger. There was something pulling me out here. Something I couldn't ignore. I came to the forest seeking freedom, but I found more than I bargained for. Lila listened intently, her curiosity piqued. She had always been drawn to people with hidden pasts, and Cade's mysterious nature intrigued her more than she could explain. I stumbled across the Ashborne years ago, just like you. Cade continued, his voice quieter now, almost a whisper against the sound of the rain. They're not like other people. They don't operate by the same rules. They're hunters, survivors, and they've lived in these woods for generations. But they're not interested in being found. If you wander too close, they'll watch you, study you, and then decide if you're worth keeping alive. I'm not one of them, but I've learned to survive in their world. They respect strength, knowledge of the land, and they know who belongs and who doesn't. You don't belong, Lila. Not here. Not to them. Lila absorbed his words, her mind racing with implications. She had come to the wilderness for escape, for solace, But now she understood that it had never been a safe refuge. It was a place of power and danger, a place where the laws of civilization meant nothing. She had walked into the heart of something ancient, something that didn't care about her reasons for being there. The Ashborne weren't just a tribe, they were a force of nature, a way of life that couldn't be understood by someone like her. Cade broke the silence again. I can get you out of here, Lila. I can help you survive. But if we're going to make it out before the Ashborne notice you're here, we'll need to move quickly. Tomorrow, when the storm dies down, we'll head south, away from their territory. You'll be safe then. The words hung heavy in the air between them. Cade had promised safety, but Lila knew that it wasn't going to be that easy. The Ashborne had already marked her, whether she knew it or not. They wouldn't just let her go. No one ever truly left their territory unscathed. The fire flickered low, casting long shadows on the cave walls, and Lila could feel her heart pounding in her chest. She had no choice but to trust Cade. He was her only chance. But as the storm raged outside, she knew that the true storm was just beginning. Chapter 4. The Escape. The next morning arrived with the same heavy, oppressive silence that had filled the night. The rain had stopped, but the storm's aftermath lingered in the dampness of the air and the thick fog that covered the forest floor. Lila, though exhausted from the ordeal, had forced herself to focus. She knew that the only way out was to move, to leave the shelter before the Ashborne could catch wind of her presence. The urgency in Cade's eyes told her that time was no longer a luxury. Cade had already packed his things, his movements efficient, almost automatic. He was the type of person who didn't need to explain every action. It was clear he had lived a life of survival. The raw intensity in his eyes, the guardedness in his posture, spoke volumes. He wasn't just leading her out of the wilderness, he was protecting her from something far more dangerous than she could imagine. Lila had gathered what little gear she had left, her ankles still tender but no longer immobilizing. With Cade's help, she hobbled to her feet, using a sturdy branch for support. She was slow, but he didn't seem to mind. He moved ahead, his eyes scanning the dense fog ahead, alert and cautious. They hadn't walked for long when Cade stopped abruptly, his body tensing. Lila caught his arm, her heart rate quickening. "What is it?" she whispered. Cade's eyes flicked toward the trees ahead. "They're close," he said. "The Ashborne are never far. Stay close to me, and don't make a sound." Lila nodded, her breath catching in her throat. She felt the weight of the forest press in on her, the heavy silence broken only by the crunch of her boots in the wet leaves. Her mind raced. Was this it? Were the Ashborne already closing in on them? Was there a way to escape? They moved as quietly as possible, but the forest seemed to hum with tension. Lila's heart pounded in her chest, her body aching from the strain. With every step, the fear mounted. She had walked into a nightmare, and now it seemed like the nightmare was catching up with her. Just as they reached the edge of a small clearing, they froze. From the shadows, figures emerged, tall, dark figures, draped in cloaks that blended seamlessly with the trees. The Ashborne. Lila's breath caught in her throat. They were here. Cade didn't hesitate. Without a word, he pushed Lila behind him, his body going taut as he reached for the weapons strapped to his back, a set of knives and a bow, all tools of survival and defense. The Ashborne hadn't made a sound, but their presence was unmistakable. They didn't need to speak to make their intentions known. "What do you want?" Cade's voice was low, almost a growl, as he addressed the leader of the group. The Ashborne didn't speak either, they only observed, their piercing eyes glinting from beneath their hoods. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. Then, without warning, the leader stepped forward. He was taller than Cade, his face concealed by a dark mask, but his eyes, their intensity seemed to reach deep into Lila's soul. "She does not belong here," he said, his voice rough and ancient, carrying an authority that made Lila's stomach twist with fear. Cade's hand tightened on the knife hilt, but he didn't move. "She is leaving. She was lost. You have no claim on her." The leader tilted his head, the slightest movement, and then nodded. "Perhaps, but the forest has its own rules. No one leaves untouched." And with that, the Ashborne leader raised his hand, and the rest of the figures shifted into action. Lila felt her heart drop into her stomach. This was how it would end. But Cade was faster. He lunged forward, his knives flashing in the dim light, striking with the precision of someone who had fought these battles before. The Ashborne reacted quickly, but it was clear they had underestimated him. Within seconds, the first figure fell, and the others hesitated, their eyes narrowing with a mix of confusion and fury. "Run!" Cade shouted to Lila, and for the first time, she didn't question him. She ran. She ran as fast as her injured leg would allow, through the thick trees, the sounds of the battle behind her growing fainter with every step. The forest seemed to open up before her, and she pushed herself forward, ignoring the sting of the branches that scraped at her arms. Somehow, against all odds, she made it. She stumbled out into a small clearing and stopped, her chest heaving with exhaustion. She looked back over her shoulder, but Cade wasn't there. Had he made it out too? Or had he stayed behind to fight? The uncertainty gnawed at her, but she knew there was no time to look back. And then, through the mist, she saw him. Cade, emerging from the trees, his clothes torn but his expression unwavering. He nodded to her, his eyes never leaving the forest behind him. "Let's go," he said simply, his voice strong. And for the first time since the trap had caught her, Lila felt a sense of hope. The storm hadn't stopped. The forest hadn't yielded. But they were out. And with Cade by her side, she had a chance at survival. Together, they walked into the unknown. But this time, Lila was ready. She wasn't alone anymore.